Hello and welcome to Marple's Mind, where every story feels like a conversation. Over a warm cup of coffee today, I bring you a brand new Miss Marple mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in. From now, let's get started. Chapter 1. The second Tuesday of June, the village of Little Watham basked in the kind of sun that made gossip bloom as fast as roses. The annual ladies' summer luncheon had spilled out of the vicarage hall and onto the lawn, where white tablecloths fluttered like sails and porcelain teacups clinked with genteel regularity. Birds chirped overhead. The scent of elderflower cordial hung sweet in the air. Miss Marple, dressed in her pale lavender lace and wide straw hat, sat quietly beneath the wisteria arch. Her knitting needles clicked with gentle rhythm, though her eyes, blue, sharp and patient, wandered. She was not knitting so much as listening. Mrs. Leonard Carraway, the vicar's wife and perennial organiser of all things respectable, was holding court near the trifle table. And of course, she declared, we owe a great debt to Mrs. Sylvia Jeffreys for arranging the flower competition this year. Such a talent for dahlias. Sylvia Jeffreys, a woman in her late 40s with auburn hair too carefully set to be natural, blushed modestly and waved a hand. Oh, it's nothing really. A bit of cheer in difficult times, that's all. A few heads turned. Difficult times was code in Little Witham. It meant whispered debts, failing marriages, secrets leaking through keyholes. Miss Marple's ears perked up, not at the words, but at the reaction. There was a tightness in Sylvia's smile. Her fingers clenched her teacup just a fraction. Too hard. Your husband not joining us, dear? Asked Mrs. Carraway, with a voice dipped in cream. He's been unwell, resting at home, Sylvia replied quickly. The sun aggravates his nerves. Miss Marple noted the silence that followed, not pitying, not surprised, guarded. The women resumed sipping their tea, but the air had changed. Moments later, a clumsy laugh broke the tension. Edith Crane, a plump widow known for her loud opinions and even louder scarves, was gesturing with a cucumber sandwich in one hand. Oh! Don't look so dour. At least no one's died this summer. That's progress. The laughter that followed was light, but forced. From her seat beneath the wisteria, Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in Sylvia Jeffreys's eyes. Across the lawn, Mary Littleton, tall, pale, unmarried, stood near the lemonade table, twisting her bracelet. She hadn't spoken once. Her gaze drifted repeatedly towards Sylvia. When she caught Miss Marple watching, she turned sharply and busied herself with folding napkins. And then, the faintest disturbance, the clatter of a teacup. Sylvia had dropped hers. So sorry, she said too brightly, as she crouched to retrieve it. Her hands trembled. Oh, don't fuss, dear, murmured Mrs. Carraway, kneeling beside her. Are you quite all right? I'm fine, just a little dizzy. Perhaps I'll go lie down for a while. You're welcome to rest inside. No, thank you. I'd rather walk. The air will do me good. And with that, Sylvia Jeffreys rose, smoothed her skirt, and walked off the lawn, her posture rigid. Miss Marple's fingers resumed knitting, But her eyes remained fixed on the narrow lane leading back toward Ivy Hollow, the grand but aging cottage where the Jeffreys lived in their slowly crumbling gentility. She didn't look back when the laughter returned. She didn't join the others when they debated sponge recipes and rhododendrons, because in that moment, sun-drenched and sweet as it was, Miss Marple felt something had shifted, something subtle, like the moment when a bird stops singing, a silence that doesn't belong. It would be 2 days before Sylvia Jeffreys was found dead at the base of her garden steps. A fall, they said. An accident. Miss Marple knew better. Something had already cracked during tea beneath the wisteria. Chapter 2. The village of Little Witham did not take well to scandal, but it certainly knew how to wear it. By the morning after Sylvia Jeffreys' death, the gossip moved faster than the milkman's rounds. At first, the whispers were polite, even sympathetic. What a tragedy, so young, so sudden. But sympathy in Little Witham was a gateway drug to speculation. "It was the stairs," said Mrs. Pike, leaning over her garden wall as the grocer's boy passed. "They twist sharply, just before the greenhouse. I nearly turned my ankle there last year. Someone should have had them fixed. Or someone did," muttered Mr. Elgin, the butcher, not quite under his breath. By noon, every lace-curtained window along Hedgecombe Lane was suspiciously ajar, and every cup of tea poured came with a spoonful of innuendo. At the vicarage, Reverend Carraway had offered a subdued prayer during morning service, speaking of life's fragility and the mysterious ways of the Lord. But his wife, Mrs. Carraway, spent the afternoon making pointed visits, ostensibly to check in on neighbours, but truly to measure the temperature of the village. At Rosewood Cottage, Miss Marple prepared her own tea in quiet solitude. The kettle whistled gently as she arranged 2 place settings, though no one else was expected. Old habits. She carried the tray to her small sitting-room and glanced briefly out the window, where a pair of magpies bickered near the garden gate. Sylvia Jeffreys' death had been called an accident. The doctor, Mr. Fenley, a tired man with arthritic fingers, had declared it a broken neck, most likely caused by a fall. But Miss Marple had listened closely when Edith Crane recounted the discovery at the greengrocer's that morning. She was lying there, poor thing, just crumpled like laundry. Her slippers had come off. And this part I can't forget. Her dressing gown was twisted round her shoulders. Not like she fell down, but like someone pulled at it. You see what I mean? Miss Marple had only nodded. She did see. Now, sipping her tea, she thought not of the fall itself, but of Sylvia's hands, how they trembled at the luncheon, a woman unsettled, a woman afraid. And then there was Mary Littleton, standing so still by the lemonade table, avoiding Sylvia's gaze as though contact would burn her. Just then, a knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Graves, round-faced, with a moustache that always seemed to wilt under pressure. He looked slightly flushed, his hat in his hands. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Inspector. Do come in. Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you." He sat gingerly, adjusting his coat. "I just came from Ivy Hollow. Sylvia Jeffreys' sisters arrived from Devon. Miss Anne Bartlett." "Ah, yes. They were close once, I believe." Graves hesitated. According to Miss Bartlett, her sister was in good spirits the last time they spoke. No mention Of illness, no dizziness. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And yet the official word is accident. Well, yes. Dr. Fenley saw no signs of a struggle. No bruising, no broken skin, just the neck, snapped like a twig. He winced. Forgive me. There's no need, Miss Marple said gently. You're doing your duty. Though I must say, it's a curious thing to fall backwards down a set of steps you've descended every day for 20 years. Graves looked uneasy. You think it wasn't an accident? I think, Miss Marple said softly, that Mrs. Jeffreys was frightened. And people who are frightened don't often wear silk dressing-gowns into their gardens at dawn, unless they're going to meet someone. Graves frowned. You believe someone lured her there? I believe she went willingly, perhaps to end an argument, or to begin one. The inspector nodded slowly. We're questioning neighbours. Some claim to have heard shouting late at night, though no one can agree on what was said or who was shouting. Miss Marple smiled, thin and quiet. The truth often hides in contradictions. As Graves left, promising to return with any updates, Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk. From a small drawer, she withdrew a folded piece of stationery, the menu from the summer luncheon, with guests' names handwritten around the seating plan. She tapped it with her finger. Sylvia had sat next to Edith Crane. Across from her was Mary Littleton, and near the end, barely engaged, mostly silent, was a young man few had noticed, Colin Jeffreys, Sylvia's stepson. He hadn't spoken once during the luncheon, but Miss Marple remembered his expression. Not grief, not boredom, resentment. She tucked the menu away. Something hidden had bubbled to the surface, and Miss Marple had learned long ago. In a village like Little Witham, it was never just one secret. Chapter 3. The funeral came quickly, with barely 3 days separating the death from the procession of black hats and lowered voices. Little Witham had a fondness for swift ceremonies, the kind that ensured respect was paid, but discomfort didn't linger too long in the summer air. Still, it was well attended. Sylvia Jeffreys had been, after all, a figure of some standing, though recent years had seen her slip further from the village's favour. Miss Marple arrived at the church with her usual unobtrusive grace. She did not speak much, nor did she impose upon the grieving. Instead, she observed, Anne Bartlett, Sylvia's younger sister, sat rigid at the front pew, her veil drawn and lips set in a line too firm for mourning alone. Her hands remained folded through the entire service, save for one curious moment, when the vicar spoke of Sylvia's kindness. At that, Anne's fingers clenched tightly in her lap, as if suppressing something unsaid. Colin Jeffreys stood to the side, shoulders square, but head lowered. A tall, angular man in his late 20s, he bore little physical resemblance to Sylvia. His father, Edwin Jeffreys, had married Sylvia in the later years of his life and died 2 summers ago, leaving Sylvia the house and Colin the inheritance, though the details of that arrangement had remained mostly unspoken. Miss Marple noted how no one approached Colin directly, not even Mary Littleton, who had once tutored him in French as a boy. Mary instead lingered near the stone arch, her gaze darting between Colin and the churchyard path, as if expecting someone who never arrived. After the service, the mourners drifted into the adjoining hall for light refreshments. ham sandwiches and weak tea being the order of the day. Miss Marple found herself beside Edith Crane once more, who leaned in with the eagerness of someone desperate to be heard. "They say it was an accident," Edith whispered, eyes wide with certainty. "But I heard she'd been locking her bedroom door. Isn't that odd? In your own house?" Miss Marple turned slightly. "How do you know that, dear?" "Oh, Mary mentioned it. Said Sylvia had been jumpy lately. Forgetful, too. Left the kettle on once and nearly scalded the cat. That's not like her." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did she say why Sylvia had been so unsettled?" "No." Edith hesitated. "Though, well, there was a rumour about a letter." "A letter?" Edith glanced around and lowered her voice. "Just before she died. Some say she wrote one. Left it tucked inside a gardening book in the sitting room. It's probably nonsense, but people do odd things when they're frightened." Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward Anne Bartlett, who stood stiffly near the buffet table speaking to Inspector Graves. Anne's expression was neutral, but her hands were clenched behind her back, white-knuckled and unmoving. Miss Marple took a step toward her, but was gently intercepted by Colin Jeffreys. "You're Miss Marple, aren't you?" She turned. "Yes, how kind of you to remember." He offered a tight smile. "You knew my stepmother well." Well enough to see that she wasn't quite herself at the summer luncheon. Colin's eyes darkened. She hadn't been herself for some time. In what way? He glanced around, lowering his voice. She grew suspicious of everyone. Accused the housekeeper of reading her letters. Said someone was watching her from the hedge. I thought it was just loneliness. She was never the same after my father passed. Miss Marple studied him. "And you? Were you close?" A pause. "We were civil. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the truth either." "She told me once," Miss Marple added gently, "that Ivy Hollow didn't feel like home anymore. That's a difficult thing, to feel unwelcome in one's own house." Colin looked away. Perhaps she was right. He excused himself quickly, disappearing into the murmuring crowd. Later that afternoon, as the village began to settle into its usual rhythm once more, albeit slightly askew, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to the library at Ivy Hollow. Anne Bartlett, now staying at the cottage to settle affairs, allowed her in politely but coolly. "I know people are talking," Anne said, not bothering to offer tea. "But it was an accident. She'd been disoriented lately. Forgetting things. It happens." "Of course," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I did hear she might have left a letter." Anne's expression flickered. "If she did, I haven't found it." Miss Marple ran her fingers along the shelf beside the hearth. Gardening books, just as Edith had said. Her fingers paused on a slim green volume titled Seasonal Pruning, A Lady's Companion to Roses. She opened it. Nothing. Anne watched her closely. Too closely. "I suppose she imagined enemies where there were none," Anne said with forced lightness. Miss Marple smiled faintly, closing the book. "Yes, or perhaps she saw something the rest of us missed." She left the cottage with the scent of dust and dried roses still lingering in her nose, and the sense that somewhere among the hedges and whispering windows the first real thread of truth had begun to tug loose. Chapter 4. By the following morning, the village had moved into its most dangerous stage, certainty. Now that the funeral was over and respectable mourning had been shown, the people of Little Witham turned to theories. The whispers had sharpened into confident declarations, and the name on most lips was Colin Jeffreys. "He never cared for her," muttered Mr. Elgin to the postmaster. "Even as a boy, he wouldn't sit with her at church." Everyone noticed. "I heard they argued over money," Mrs. Pike added, lowering her voice despite standing alone in her own kitchen. "He wanted to sell Ivy Hollow. Sylvia refused. Can't blame her. His father would have rolled in his grave." At the village shop, Inspector Graves stood just inside the doorway, speaking quietly with the grocer. Though not officially announcing anything, his presence there was signal enough. Everyone assumed he was confirming what they already knew. Meanwhile, at Rosewood Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window with a small notebook open on her lap. She was not the type to scribble wildly or circle names in dramatic red ink. No, her notes were tidy, unobtrusive, and coded in the way a lifetime of social deduction had taught her. She wrote only 3 words this morning. "Too easy. Watch." Because Colin Jeffreys was the perfect suspect. Too perfect, in fact. Resentful stepson. Beneficiary. A strained relationship known to the village. But Miss Marple had lived too long to believe in tidy crimes wrapped in village gossip. And Colin, for all his awkwardness and distance, had shown something else. Restraint, controlled responses, measured words, grief? Perhaps not. But guilt? No, not yet. That afternoon Miss Marple made her way to Ivy Hollow once more, this time under the pretence of offering help with Sylvia's personal effects. Anne Bartlett met her at the gate, less guarded than before, though her face was lined with fatigue. "It's all so overwhelming," Anne sighed, leading Miss Marple through the hallway. "Everything here still smells like her. I half expect to hear her voice from the drawing-room." "I imagine you'll find many small things to sort," Miss Marple said kindly. "The bits and pieces people leave behind often say more than their wills." They entered Sylvia's bedroom. The space was neat, carefully kept, but carried a certain heaviness, as though the air itself remembered arguments never finished. A blue scarf lay folded on the armchair. A half-read book, The Orchid Thief, rested spine up on the nightstand. Mrs. Marple glanced toward the vanity, where a small bottle of perfume sat uncapped beside a neatly closed drawer. A faint impression in the dust suggested something had recently been moved. "Did Sylvia wear scent often?" Miss Marple asked casually. Anne shook her head. "Rarely. She was allergic. That belonged to someone else. I think it was left from a guest. Curious." Anne crossed her arms. "I assume the inspector has his eye on Colin. That's what everyone wants, isn't it? For it to be simple?" "People do like tidy answers," Miss Marple agreed softly, "though they rarely fit the messiness of real life." Downstairs, as Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, the housekeeper, Mrs. Ludlow, emerged from the scullery with flushed cheeks and flour on her sleeves. "Miss Marple," she said nervously, wiping her hands, "I hope you won't think me foolish, but there's something I noticed the night before Mrs. Jeffreys passed." Miss Marple turned with quiet interest. "Do go on." "I came to collect the supper tray late. She'd eaten little, but the back door was unbolted. That's not like her. She was careful, always double-checked the locks. I bolted it myself, but something about it gave me a shiver. Did you mention this to Inspector Graves? I did. He said it wasn't relevant. Mrs. Ludlow paused, her voice low. But I know when something isn't right, and that night the house felt off. Miss Marple offered her a gentle smile. You've a very good memory, Mrs. Ludlow. It may prove more useful than you know. She stepped outside, the air brisk despite the sun. A distant church bell tolled once, somewhere beyond the trees. And as she walked past the rose trellis, she noticed something new. Barely a scrap, caught on a thorn. A sliver of black fabric. Silk by the look of it. She didn't touch it. Instead, she stood quietly, letting the silence settle around her. The village was wrong. Colin Jeffreys was angry. But Miss Marple had seen grief take many forms, and this wasn't guilt. It was bitterness, real and raw, but not concealed violence. No, the answer lay elsewhere. In the gap between a back door left ajar and a perfume bottle that didn't belong. In the spaces people thought no one would notice. Chapter 5. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows when Miss Marple arrived unannounced at the vicarage. She was greeted not by the Reverend, but by his wife, Mrs. Carroway, who was already dressed in her gardening hat and gloves, a pair of shears in one hand and a basket of lavender in the other. Miss Marple! What a surprise! Do come in, though I must apologize for the state of the parlour. I've been reorganizing the hymnals. No need to fuss, dear, Miss Marple said warmly. I won't take a moment. I only wanted to ask if you remembered. The luncheon seating. Mrs. Carroway tilted her head. The luncheon? You mean last week's? Yes, specifically. Who sat beside Sylvia Jeffreys? Well, Mrs. Carroway considered. Let's see. Edith Crane on one side, of course, and I believe it was young Colin across from her. Then further down, Anne had already left by that point, hadn't she? Ah, and Mary Littleton. She arrived a bit late and ended up just beside Edith. Sylvia barely acknowledged her. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You noticed that as well. Yet not too. Sylvia could be pointed when she wanted. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back to the lane, the conversation quietly brewing in her mind. She wasn't looking for drama. She was looking for tension, the sort that people attempted to smooth over but never truly concealed. And there had been something in the way Mary Littleton had stood near the lemonade table, barely speaking. Not avoidance, exactly, guilt or fear. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mary Littleton's modest cottage on the edge of the village. The house was tidy, though slightly faded, the sort that hinted at careful budgeting and lonely evenings. Mary herself answered the door with a faint smile and reddened eyes. Miss Marple, how kind of you. I won't impose, Miss Marple said gently. I only wanted to check in. I imagine it's been a difficult week. Mary hesitated, then opened the door wider. Would you like some tea? Inside, the sitting room was lined with books, mostly literature, with a few volumes of poetry arranged with meticulous care. On a side table sat a small vase of fresh tulips, their stems perfectly trimmed. It was the sort of home where everything had a place, except, perhaps, peace of mind. As Mary poured the tea, her hand trembled slightly. It doesn't feel real, she said. Sylvia was. She could be hard, yes, but I never thought. Miss Marple waited. Mary sat, We hadn't spoken properly in months. Were you close once? A pause. Very. Years ago, before she married Edwin. We taught together briefly, and then life shifted. She changed. Miss Marple took a sip of tea. People don't change so much as reveal themselves more plainly. Mary looked down at her hands. She was proud. Always needed to be the centre of attention. But she wasn't cruel, not truly. Just guarded. She had secrets, even from those she trusted. Did she ever mention a letter? Mary's eyes lifted sharply. A letter? I heard she may have written one before she died. Perhaps left it somewhere in the house. Mary looked away. No, she never said anything to me. It was almost convincing. Almost. Miss Marple set her cup down. Do you recall the perfume Sylvia kept on her vanity? Mary blinked. She didn't wear perfume. It gave her migraines. Indeed. And yet there's a bottle now. Half empty, floral, unfamiliar. Not something easily mistaken. Mary swallowed. Perhaps Anne brought it. Perhaps, Miss Marple echoed softly. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Mary asked, almost too casually, Do you think someone pushed her? Miss Marple didn't answer at first. I think someone wanted us to believe she simply fell, and that someone knew just how to make the story neat enough to be accepted. As she left the cottage, the wind picked up, rustling. The hedges. Miss Marple turned briefly to glance at Mary's window. The curtain shifted slightly, as if someone had been watching her walk away. That evening, back at Rosewood Cottage, Miss Marple reopened her small notebook. This time she jotted down a single phrase. The perfume doesn't belong. It was a small thing, easily dismissed. But Miss Marple knew. Real crimes were stitched from small things. Details overlooked, habits disrupted, objects misplaced not by accident, but by intention. She returned to the seating plan, now creased with use. Mary had sat just within reach of Sylvia. Just close enough to slip something into her handbag, just close enough to see the fear without, asking what caused it. The truth was still hidden, but it had started to flicker. In the petals of tulips too neatly arranged, in the perfume that didn't belong, in the friendships that used to be something more. The detail everyone else had missed was no longer hidden. It was just waiting to be seen. Chapter 6 by the weekend, Ivy Hollow had become a place people passed more quickly than they used to. There was no official declaration of suspicion, no policeman at the gates, but something in the air had shifted. The flowers at the gatepost were beginning to wilt. The neighbours had stopped delivering casseroles. In Little Wytham, such withdrawal was telling. It meant the village had made up its mind, even if it hadn't quite agreed on the details. Miss Marple, however, had not yet made up hers. On Saturday afternoon, she took a quiet stroll through the footpath near the little brook. The sun filtered gently through the leaves, and wildflowers bloomed in unruly clumps. She wasn't walking without purpose. She had asked Edith Crane to meet her there, under the pretext of fresh air for the nerves, which Edith, being perpetually in need of validation, had eagerly accepted. "Oh, Miss Marple!" Edith exclaimed, breathlessly as she arrived, adjusting her shawl. "I do hope you haven't called me out here for anything dreadful." "Not dreadful, dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "Merely delicate." Edith's eyes sparkled. Gossip was far preferable to dread. Is it about Sylvia? In a way. I've been thinking about friendships, long ones, complicated ones. Edith let out a breathy laugh. Well, you know how it is with women. We're close, then we're cold, then close again, especially when men are involved. Ah, said Miss Marple, with just enough pause to invite elaboration. Edith glanced sideways. Sylvia and Mary were like that. Always a bit too intense, if you ask me. Practically inseparable in their 30s. But then something happened. No one ever said what. Miss Marple nodded. Some sort of falling out? A long one? Sylvia once told me Mary was too eager to play the victim. And Mary, well, she never said anything harsh, but she avoided Sylvia after Edwin died. And that was curious, wasn't it, when most people would have drawn closer? They walked in silence a moment, the crunch of gravel underfoot filling the space. I wonder, Miss Marple mused aloud, whether Mary avoided Sylvia, or Sylvia avoided Mary. Edith blinked. I hadn't thought of it that way. Most people don't, Miss Marple said gently, but fear has a way of choosing its own company. Back in the village, Inspector Graves was speaking quietly, with Colin Jeffries outside the post office. Miss Marple passed close enough to catch fragments of the conversation, mostly about money. I told you, Colin said, his voice low but firm. I don't know anything about a revised will. Yet your stepmother told her solicitor she intended to make changes, Graves countered, that someone had pressured her. Colin's jaw tightened. She said things like that when she felt out of control. Miss Marple didn't interrupt. She simply filed it away. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden with a cup of warm milk, staring at the hedge where the magpies had returned. She thought again about the perfume bottle, about Mary's red-rimmed eyes, about Edith's comment, too eager to play the victim. There was something unspoken between Mary and Sylvia, something old, something unfinished, and the more Miss Marple considered it, the clearer the shape of the lie became, not in what had been said, but in what had been carefully omitted. The following day, she invited Anne Bartlett to tea at Rosewood Cottage. Anne arrived in a slate-grey coat, clutching her handbag like it might vanish. She looked older than she had days ago, as though the weight of the estate had begun to press in from all sides. "Thank you for the invitation," she said, sliding into the small parlour seat. "I could use the distraction." "I thought as much," Miss Marple replied. "You must be quite exhausted with all the arrangements." Anne exhaled. "The solicitor's been asking about letters, Sylvia's finances, what changes she might have made. It's all so messy." She was going to alter her will, wasn't she? Anne's mouth tightened. "Yes, I only found out because she left the draft open in her bureau. She planned to leave Ivy Hollow to someone else." "To whom?" Anne looked down. "Mary." Miss Marple didn't react. "Not Colin." No, she felt Colin only wanted the land sold. She said Mary would preserve it. "That's a generous sentiment," Miss Marple said mildly. "Considering their past." Anne's lips parted, then pressed closed again. "She never told you why they stopped speaking?" Anne hesitated. "Only that it was about a man." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Edwin?" Anne shook her head. "Before him, someone neither of them married. There it was, a ghost from the past, unspoken, unfinished. Miss Marple offered a plate of seed cake, and Anne took one, though she didn't eat. When the visit ended, Miss Marple remained seated, staring into the fireplace, though no fire burned. A triangle had formed: Sylvia, Mary, and someone unnamed. A fracture that had festered for years. But who had truly suffered for it, and who had used it? In Little Witham, secrets didn't vanish. They simply changed shape. And Miss Marple now suspected this one had changed into something deadly. Chapter 7 Rain returned to Little Witham with an almost theatrical sense of timing. By Tuesday morning, heavy clouds smothered the village sky, and the soft rhythm of rain on slate rooftops cast a hush across the lanes. It was not the kind of storm that frightened. It was the kind that settled slow and soaking, as if the village itself were being pressed for secrets. At Ivy Hollow, Inspector Graves stood beneath the dripping portico, his coat darkened by the weather, a folded umbrella useless at his side. He had been summoned urgently by Anne Bartlett. Inside, the air was sharp with vinegar and beeswax. Anne stood near the staircase, pale, her fingers trembling slightly as she gestured toward a low table in the parlour. "There," she said. "I found it not an hour ago. Someone slid it beneath the cushion. I only sat down by chance." Graves crossed the room, lifted the floral cushion, and withdrew a folded piece of paper, aged, faintly creased, but unmistakably recent. It was a letter. The signature read, "Sylvia. I recognize her handwriting," Anne whispered. "I used to forge her excuse notes at school." Graves scanned it quickly, brow furrowing. "You'll want to see this," he muttered. An hour later, the letter lay spread on Miss Marple's table. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion. "To whomever finds this, if anything happens, to me it will not be an accident. I have been watched. I have heard footsteps where no one should be. I trusted someone once, long ago, and now that trust is being used against me. I fear they've returned, not out of affection, but out of guilt, or worse, I cannot say more. But Mary knows why. She always did." S.J. Miss Marple read it twice, then again more slowly, her eyes narrowing at each word. It wasn't quite a confession. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was fear on paper, cryptic, fractured, and painfully intimate. Graves sat across from her, tapping his pen absently on the edge of the table. "It's not admissible, not in a proper legal sense. No direct accusation, no mention of a crime." "But it tells a story," Miss Marple murmured, "or suggests one." She looked up. "No, Inspector, there's a difference." The letter had not been discarded. It had been hidden, and not well, beneath a cushion in the parlour, a place more careless than careful. That meant someone had either wanted it found eventually, or they had been interrupted before it could be destroyed. Miss Marple returned the letter to its envelope. Where was Mary Littleton when the letter was discovered? Home, apparently. Anne said she hadn't visited in days. Miss Marple didn't respond. She merely folded her hands in her lap and thought. That afternoon, word of the letter spread, and the village reacted as it always did, with a mixture of dread and relish. Most villagers hadn't read it, of course, but that hardly stopped them from quoting it as if they had. The phrase "Mary knows why" echoed from cottage to cottage, carried by gossip like pollen on wind. Mary Littleton did not attend her usual reading group at the church hall. She did not open her curtains. The only sign of life was a plume of chimney smoke around dusk, and the brief shadow of someone pacing behind drawn drapes. It was Colin Jeffreys who brought the next surprise. He appeared at Miss Marple's door, just after sunset, his collar damp, a man caught somewhere between confusion and resolve. "I thought you should have this," he said, handing her a small photograph. "I found it tucked into one of my father's gardening books." Miss Marple studied it under the lamp. It was faded but clear enough. A photograph of 3 young people. Sylvia, in her 20s, seated on a garden bench. Beside her, Mary, hair tied back, smiling with uncharacteristic ease. And standing behind them, resting a hand lightly on each of their shoulders, an unfamiliar man, thin, tall, dark hair, unmistakably central. On the back, in faint pencil, was a single name, Thomas. Miss Marple set the photo down carefully. "You don't know who he is?" she asked. Colin shook his head. "Never seen him before." She looked at him, and yet Sylvia kept this. Hidden, yes, but not discarded. She must have meant to destroy it and couldn't. Or she meant to remember. As Colin left, Miss Marple stood in the soft light of her sitting room, holding the photograph between thumb and forefinger. Thomas, not Edwin, not a brother or cousin, someone from before, someone who had once stood between 2 friends. Before, something had gone terribly, quietly wrong. The past had returned, not loudly, not with vengeance, but with guilt and consequence. And somewhere in that quiet reckoning, someone had decided Sylvia Jeffreys couldn't be allowed to tell the secret. She'd never spoken aloud. Chapter 8. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a dampness that clung to the village like memory. Pavement glistened, leaves dripped, and in Little Witham people walked a little slower, speaking in quieter tones, as though they feared the truth might be listening. Miss Marple sat alone in her garden, a small pot of tea at her side, and the photograph of Sylvia Mary and the man named Thomas resting on her lap. The image, though decades old, hummed with a quiet tension. There was something in the way the women leaned slightly away from each other, something in the man's casual, oblivious hands. It was a portrait of something that had already begun to fracture. Only none of them had realized it yet, but Sylvia had kept it, and now Sylvia was dead. Miss Marple sipped her tea and waited. She didn't have to wait long. By midday, Mary Littleton appeared at her gate, wrapped in a pale green coat, with a brooch that had once belonged to her mother. Her eyes were tired, her face drawn. She didn't look guilty. She looked cornered. "May I come in?" she asked, voice low. Miss Marple nodded, ushering her toward the sitting room. "I've heard," Mary said once they were seated, "about the letter." Miss Marple said nothing. "And the photograph?" Still silence. Mary let out a thin breath. "You think I did it?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that Sylvia was afraid, and I think the person she feared knew her too well to frighten her loudly." Mary's hands tightened in her lap. "You don't know what she was like. After Edwin died, something in her changed. She started rewriting things, rewriting us, as if I were the one who betrayed her." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And Did you?" Mary's lips parted, but she said nothing. "She kept the photograph," Miss Marple continued. "She didn't destroy it. She tucked it away, much like the letter." Mary looked away. "She loved Thomas. We both did. The room fell still. She met him first," Mary continued, her voice flat. "But he wasn't serious, not at first. He was warm with everyone. But when he turned toward me, really looked at me, I thought, just once, it might be my turn. Sylvia never let anything be mine, not even grief." "Miss Marple waited. She told me she forgave me," Mary said softly. "Years later. But she never did. She just held on to it, wore it like a shroud. And now?" "She was going to leave me the house," Mary said, her voice breaking. "As if that would make it right. As if I'd accept it like some kind of second-place prize." Miss Marple stood slowly, walked to the corner cupboard, and retrieved a small, delicate teacup, different from the usual set, a gift, long unused. "Do you recognize this?" she asked. Mary blinked. "It's from Sylvia's engagement tea. I gave her that set. She never used it, except once, at the luncheon. She insisted on bringing her own cup. I thought it strange. Mary said nothing. I think she was afraid someone would tamper with her drink," Miss Marple said. "But in trying to protect herself, she drew more attention, not from everyone, but from someone who remembered the pattern." Miss Marple walked slowly to the fireless hearth. "And I think she brought that cup knowing it might be her last act of defiance, because she suspected, and she wanted you to know that she knew." Mary stood abruptly. "You have no proof?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Only understanding." Mary stared at her, trembling. "I didn't plan it. I went to speak with her, that's all. But she was smug. So sure she'd won, again. I just wanted her to hear me." Miss Marple let the silence return. "And then?" she asked gently. Mary sat again, slowly, as if all strength had left her. "We argued." She turned to walk away. She was at the top of the garden steps. I didn't mean to, but I caught her arm. She slipped. She didn't cry. She simply sat there, staring at her own hands as if they were no longer hers. Miss Marple offered her the photograph. Mary looked at it once, then turned it face down. She was never going to let it go, she whispered. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but neither were you." The trap had not been a lie or a trick. It had been memory. A single image, a name neither woman had spoken aloud in years. And in that silence, Miss Marple had found the noise. The truth had always been hiding in the space between guilt and forgiveness, and now it had nowhere left to go. Chapter 9. The next morning, little Wytham returned to its routine, or rather, attempted to. The baker's window was filled with sugared scones, and the postman made his rounds with forced cheer. But beneath the familiar surface, something had shifted. The village felt quieter, not solemn, but still, as if it were holding its breath. At Ivy Hollow, Anne Bartlett busied herself with boxes and folded linens, determined to pack away her sister's life with minimal ceremony. Inspector Graves had visited earlier, though Mary Littleton's name had not been spoken officially. There had been no arrest, no headline, no confrontation. Miss Marple had asked for a delay in reporting. That afternoon she hosted what she called a quiet gathering. A few of the villagers, invited under the modest pretence of sharing memories of Sylvia. Tea was poured, and lemon biscuits offered, though few were eaten. The vicar, Mrs. Carroway, Edith Crane, Colin Jeffreys, Anne Bartlett, and, arriving last, Mary Littleton. Mary's entrance was not dramatic. Her face betrayed no signs of what had passed the day before, but Miss Marple saw it, the stiffness in her shoulders, the tension behind her eyes. She sat near the window and said little. "I'm grateful to you all for coming," Miss Marple began. "It's strange, isn't it? How someone can leave a room so suddenly and yet still be everywhere." There were nods, silence. Miss Marple continued softly. "We remember Sylvia in different ways. Some saw her as proud, others as generous. But no one could deny she had presence. She could fill a room," Edith murmured. "Or empty one," Mary said, voice even. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she had the gift of lingering. She reached into the side table and retrieved a small envelope. The letter. "I debated whether to share this," she said. "But in light of what we now know, I think it best." She handed it to Inspector Graves, who stood in the doorway, having quietly entered minutes earlier. He read aloud, his voice measured. "If anything happens to me, it will not be an accident. Mary knows why." No one moved. Colin frowned. She wrote that about Mary. Anne said nothing. Her face had gone pale. Graves folded the paper. "It isn't an official accusation," he said, "but it does raise questions." Miss Marple turned toward Mary gently. "And perhaps it's time we let the truth be spoken." Mary's hands were folded tightly in her lap. "She came to me," Miss Marple said, "not to confess, not directly, but to explain, and in doing so, she told me what had gone unsaid for years." Miss Marple looked at the room, her voice calm, her words deliberate. "Sylvia and Mary once loved the same man, Thomas, long before Edwin. Their friendship suffered, but it never quite broke. They tried to continue, but pain left unspoken turns into bitterness. Sylvia never forgave, and Mary never forgot. Still, Mary remained silent, but her expression was no longer neutral. It had softened into something older, worn. "She came to confront Sylvia the night she died," Miss Marple said, "perhaps hoping for closure, perhaps not. There was a struggle, not violent, not planned, just two women reaching past the point of reason. Sylvia stumbled, fell. A beat of silence passed. Then Graves stepped forward. "Is that true, Miss Littleton?" Mary finally looked up. "Yes." "No, tears, just stillness. I didn't mean for it to happen," she said. "I went there to speak to her, to ask her to stop, withholding everything, the inheritance, the bitterness. And she laughed. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe I just heard it that way." She looked down at her hands. I touched her arm. She pulled away, and then she was gone. Graves nodded slowly. "You understand, of course, there'll be a statement to make." Mary nodded once and stood abruptly, knocking over her teacup. She was going to leave you the house." "Yes," Mary said softly, "and I never wanted it. Not like that." Colin turned toward the window, the tension in his shoulders easing. The room felt oddly balanced, as though something long off-kilter had finally settled into place. Miss Marple, calm and unmoved, began to pour a fresh pot of tea. "It's often the case," she said gently, "that old grief outlives logic. And when it's left to rot in silence, it turns poisonous, not in a vial, but in the heart." She offered Mary a cup. Mary hesitated and then accepted. Outside, the clouds began to thin, a rare break in the grey, and in that narrow shaft of light the quiet truth had been allowed its place. Justice would follow, in due course. But for now, the silence was no longer avoidance. It was understanding. Chapter 10. The following morning, the village of Little Witham looked almost unchanged. Hedges neatly trimmed, flower beds recovering from the rain, and the faint sound of a church bell echoing across the hills. Yet behind the lace curtains and familiar smiles, the air held something quieter than relief and heavier than gossip. Word had spread, not officially, but through the usual channels. Mary Littleton had confessed, or at least admitted. The line between the two was still debated, in hushed tones at the grocer and along the footpath near the vicarage. Some believed it was an accident. Others insisted it was always going to end this way. Few had seen it coming, but most, in retrospect, claimed they had. Miss Marple, for her part, did not indulge in that sort of talk. Instead, she sat in the vicarage garden with Inspector Graves, who had come, unofficially, for a second cup of tea and a final word. The hydrangeas were in bloom. A robin pecked near the sundial. "I suppose we should have seen it earlier," Graves admitted, stirring his tea. There was tension, yes, but no signs of violence, no bruises, no struggle. "Because it wasn't a murder, not in the conventional sense," Miss Marple said softly. "It was a reckoning," Graves nodded, "and the letter helped. Not just the letter," she corrected. "The perfume, the teacup, the fear. It all told a story, if one listened carefully enough." She leaned forward slightly. Sylvia brought her own teacup to the luncheon, a pattern no longer in use. A small gesture, but revealing. She feared being poisoned, or at least tampered with. That fear wasn't paranoia. It was the memory of betrayal. Graves listened intently. The perfume on her vanity didn't belong. Sylvia never wore scent, but someone who visited her regularly did. Someone comfortable enough to enter her room, perhaps even to gift it to her. That person was Mary. Graves frowned. She said Anne may have left it. She did, but it was a deflection. Mary had been in that room recently, and often enough for Sylvia to begin fearing her intentions. Miss Marple folded her hands, the sunlight glinting off her teacup. Then there was the photograph. Sylvia could have destroyed it long ago, but she didn't, because despite her bitterness, she hadn't let go. And in keeping it, she gave us the missing piece, the name Thomas. He was the source of the fracture, and the fracture, left unhealed, became the motive. Graves leaned back. She came to confront Sylvia, but she didn't plan to harm her. No, that's what makes it so tragic. Sylvia taunted her, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of pain. Mary reacted, not with hatred, but desperation. And Sylvia fell. Miss Marple let the silence linger. She wrote the letter, knowing something was coming. She left clues in everything. She did, not for us necessarily, but for herself, perhaps as insurance. perhaps as an apology. Graves exhaled slow. The solicitor confirmed the will. Sylvia had signed a new draft, but it hadn't been filed. She intended to leave Ivy Hollow to Mary. A final attempt at making peace, I suppose. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. And perhaps she believed. That would be enough. Graves stood. It won't be an easy case to close. The Crown may treat it as involuntary manslaughter. But she'll never be the same woman again. No one ever is, Miss Marple murmured, after crossing the line between grief and guilt. As Graves departed, Miss Marple remained in the garden, watching a pair of starlings dart through the hedge. Somewhere, a kettle whistled in the distance. Life continued, quietly, respectfully, but not without change. Ivy Hollow would pass hands again. Mary would face her reckoning, however gentle or firm the law might be. Anne would return to Devon. Colin would likely sell what was left. And little Wytham would, in time, settle back into its rhythm. But Miss Marple knew, beneath every village, garden, and every polite conversation, something always simmered. Some secrets stayed buried, others waited, and every so often one rose to the surface, like the one Sylvia never told, until it was too late. Chapter 11, the letter came 2 days later, hand-delivered, not posted. It bore no return address, just a modest seal in wax, and Miss Marple's name written in small angular script. She recognized the handwriting at once. Mary Littleton. She opened it slowly, her fingers careful, not for fear of what it said, but out of respect. The paper was thick, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if the writer had paused, perhaps more than once, unsure whether to go on. Dear Miss Marple, I've never been good with endings. Words fail when one is supposed to explain the most unforgivable parts of themselves, and yet I owe you more than silence. You listened, not to defend me, not even to pity me, but to understand they've decided on a formal charge, manslaughter. A suspended sentence likely, though I suspect I've already begun the real punishment. I keep thinking about the photograph, about the way we smiled without knowing how brittle we all were. Thomas is dead now. Died in France, I'm told. Sylvia never spoke of him again after that summer, and neither did I. But he remained between us, like a door we locked but never opened. When I saw her that night, I didn't want her to suffer. I wanted her to hear me, just once, to see that I had been hurt too. But she couldn't, or wouldn't, and so I reached out. Now she is gone, and I live in the empty echo of that silence. Thank you for seeing what no one else did. Mary. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it gently in the drawer beside her armchair, alongside old theatre programmes and a pressed violet from her niece's wedding. A life, she knew, was not made of grand events, but of small gestures, some kind, some cruel, most irreversible. The village did not speak Mary's name often after that. Her cottage stood empty now, the shutters drawn, a faint for-sale notice. In the garden. People passed by it quietly, as if not wanting to wake something. Anne Bartlett, after finalizing the estate, returned to Devon. She left no forwarding address. Colin Jeffreys, now officially the heir, sold Ivy Hollow to a solicitor from London. He did not stay to oversee the sale. The house emptied as swiftly as the truth had surfaced. Miss Marple, however, remained, She walked the same lanes, tended her roses, wrote her letters in neat, upright script, but her eyes were keener, if possible, than ever before. At the grocer's, Mrs. Pike whispered that she always knew Mary had a dark side. Her quietness, she insisted, was always too deliberate. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely raised an eyebrow and asked after the gooseberries, because she understood something deeper than motive. She understood the why behind the how, that beneath every act of cruelty often lay a wound, and behind every silence a choice not to speak when it mattered most. And that was the true tragedy, not the fall, not even the bitterness, but the fact that two women, once inseparable, had spent half a lifetime pretending there was nothing left to say. In the end, it wasn't hate that destroyed them. It was everything they never said aloud. Chapter 12. The case faded from headlines before it had ever truly arrived in them. No reporters came to Little Witham. No court sketch appeared in the London papers. To outsiders, it was little more than a private tragedy, unremarkable in its quietness, ordinary in its outcome. But for those in the village, it lingered like a low note in a familiar song, subtle but impossible to ignore. Weeks passed. The leaves turned faintly gold at the edges, and the routines of life resumed. Ivy Hollow, now cleared and echoing, sat with windows shuttered. Children stopped daring each other to run past it. It no longer thrilled. It simply stood, emptied of secrets, but not of memory. At Rosewood Cottage, Miss Marple received a visitor, one cool afternoon. Inspector Graves, in his usual hat and with his usual tired eyes. "I thought you'd want to see this," he said, handing her a thin envelope, brown and formal. Came from the solicitor managing the Jeffreys estate. Cleared. For record. Miss Marple took it, her hands steady. The envelope bore no great markings, just a date and a case number. But inside was something far more final than the village's gossip. A handwritten note. Formal, dated, notarized, a revised will, signed and witnessed 3 days before Sylvia's death. Sylvia Jane Jeffreys, being of sound mind, do hereby leave Ivy Hollow, its contents, and surrounding land to Mary Littleton of Hedgecombe Lane. This is a personal decision based on long-standing friendship, and not the influence or persuasion of any other party. The second clause amended a previous will that had favoured Colin Jeffreys. There it was, confirmed, a document no one had believed existed. "I suppose," Graves said, "some part of her wanted Mary to have the house, whether out of love, guilt, or a final kind of forgiveness." Miss Marple stared at the signature. "She knew," she said quietly. Graves nodded. "Knew what?" "That Mary would come, that the past would surface, and yet she still changed the will. She wanted her truth to live on, even if she wouldn't. Shifted. Do you think she hoped for reconciliation?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. "I think she hoped for closure, but people don't always arrive with peace in their hands. Sometimes they bring the weight of everything left unsaid." She placed the will back into the envelope and set it beside the letter Mary had sent days earlier. 2 testaments, one written before the tragedy, the other after, both burdened by memory. That evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village, pausing at the garden gate of Mary's former cottage. The tulip bed had gone to seed, The windows still shuttered. A boy rode past on his bicycle. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The village, unchanged in appearance, had shifted in feeling. Just slightly. Just enough. When she returned home, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and composed a single-page letter to her niece in Bournemouth. It was warm and unassuming, a small note about weather, the garden, and an upcoming fête. She did not mention the case. She never did. Because some truths are not for retelling. They are for remembering. And in her memory, Sylvia Jeffreys would remain seated beneath the wisteria, fingers trembling slightly on a teacup she had chosen for herself. Not a victim, not a villain, just a woman who carried too much of the past, and who, in the end, left behind one final, undeniable clue, her silence broken.